So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Stewart Patrick. I'm a senior fellow and director of the program on global order and institutions at the other Carnegie, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. I have to say that there's a little bit of an air of unreality to this gathering, at least coming from Washington, D.C. Here we are in a gilded Venetian palace, asked to imagine planetary governance in the same month that the American people voted to return to the White House a populist nationalist committed to a hyper-sovereigntist vision of the future. This conference, with its calls for planetarism, is MAGA's worst nightmare. It's the fever dream of globalists run amok. And yet, I want to submit that, at least in some respects, the folks gathered here are the true realists, because they understand that humanity has entered a new relationship with the living planet, one warranting a Kuhnian revolution. It's ironic that political realism, which dominates Western thinking about the international relations, always depicts states as being locked in a competitive state of nature. And yet that same theory never pauses to stop and ask about the state of nature itself, that is, of the living planet. The global environmental emergency, including the breaching of planetary tipping points, planetary limits that define a safe and just operating space for humanity, has exposed the contradictions between a global political system comprising 193 individual territorial units with an Earth system that obviously obeys none of those boundaries and is nearing tipping points. We're jeopardizing the habitability of the only known planet to support human life, although, as we heard, there may be many others. And yet the collective response to this catastrophe has been one of abject failure. We've seen this twice already this month. At the beginning of this month, I was in Cali, Colombia, where the world was gathered for the 16th Conference of Parties for the Global Convention on Biological Diversity, which was intended to slow humanity's, quote, suicidal war against nature. It ended in disarray. And this futility and sense of futility has been even greater at COP29 in Baku, which failed to alter the dismal trajectory in the latest emissions gap report. So how can we close the gap between these two worlds, the political world and the natural world? One radical answer has been proposed by Johan Rockström and scientists on the Earth Commission. They advocate replacing the venerable concept of the global commons with a new framework they call the planetary commons. Under international law, as you all know, there are only four recognized global commons: the high seas, the atmosphere, Antarctica, and outer space. Rockström and company argue that the principle of the global commons, which was invented during the Holocene, is no longer appropriate to the Anthropocene. What's needed instead of a nested framework of Earth system governance to stabilize fragile biomes and natural systems. And they call for planetary institutions, for instance, to govern the biosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, or land, and the cryosphere, or the Earth's frozen regions. An overarching leviathan of sorts would supervise the complex interactions and feedbacks between these different systems. Needless to say, this proposal collides headlong with the concept of state sovereignty. No doubt, established global commons are all under strain already. The high seas and outer space, for instance, are congested, competitive, and increasingly conflictual. But the global commons itself remain resilient as a concept, precisely because they do not interfere with sovereignty. These are domains that belong to nobody and to everybody. The proposed planetary commons, in contrast, would be a frontal assault on state sovereignty. It implies a hierarchical supranational body to supervise important biomes, such as the Amazon rainforest or boreal forests, as well as over biophysical and chemical processes that fall within the jurisdiction of individual countries, or even just groups of countries. So we face a quandary. Given the near certainty of transgressing planetary tipping points under a business-as-usual trajectory, we need a new commons concept and new institutions to go with it. But how do we get from here to there in an age of populism and nationalism? Here are four priorities in practical terms. First, we must expand the concept of sovereign responsibility while avoiding a full frontal assault on sovereignty, which would be a fool's errand. Consider the row that erupted in 2019 between President Emmanuel Macron of France and his Brazilian counterpart, Jair Bolsonaro. Macron accused the Brazilian of ecocide as fires raged in the Amazon, and Bolsonaro replied that Brazil's sovereignty would not be infringed upon. This was a dialogue of the death between one leader who spoke of the Amazon, who spoke of Brazil as the owner of the Amazon, and another leader who spoke of Brazil as the custodian of the Amazon for all of humanity. A new era of environmental stewardship will require a two-pronged approach, normative and material. The obligations of sovereignty must include a duty not to harm the Earth system, and those acting on the planet's behalf must be compensated. Second, the world's great powers, particularly the US and China, must adapt to a new form of geopolitics that actually puts the emphasis on geo, as in the Earth. Today, we live in two different worlds at once: a Westphalian system where the zero-sum logic of interstate competition prevails, and an Anthropocene where the logic of planetary habitability must prevail. Great powers need to learn to compartmentalize their strategic rivalry, lest their obsession with relative position overwhelm shared long-term interest in a healthy planet. Third, we cannot ignore or wish away the everyday concerns of citizens who are less concerned, and understandably so, with the end of the world than with the end of the month, that is, making rent. We must convince publics that the temporal distance between those two ends is much closer than they imagine, and that investing and protecting Earth's natural capital is the key to their survival, prosperity, and welfare. This instrumental framing may raise hackles, but failing to connect nature-positive economics with everyday concerns would be political malpractice. Fourth and finally, pushing for a global planetary leviathan at this stage would be unrealistic and costly, a distraction given the resistance it would create and the urgency of our situation, which should be focused on immediate and drastic emissions cuts. Such a universalizing approach could also become oppressive, since it would run roughshod over global diversity and pluralism and impose itself on local communities and authorities, including indigenous populations that are only constitute 6% of the world's population, but control and are custodians for at least a third of all of the world's most biodiverse regions. It's worth remembering in this regard that the idea of a commons is a social category that can emerge only through dialogue. A more legitimate, if incremental, approach would try to bring greater coherence and political clout to what we have as a sprawling collage of underpowered environmental treaties and organizations. One place to begin is by pushing for a World Environmental Organization backed by a global pact for nature. Politics, it's often said, is the art of the possible. The aim of planetary politics must be to expand the boundaries of what is possible. I hope this gathering will help us advance this goal. Thank you very much.